Well, welcome everybody. It's like I said earlier, it is really fabulous to see so many of you here during the end of a very full year. And I'm excited that I'm seeing new names that I haven't seen here very often. So welcome. This is our last event of the year. These are our pedagogy, innovation, and technology pit stops. And these are organized by the Transformational Change Initiative. And we broadcast them system-wide to all of our campuses. And we try to be very responsive to what we're hearing from faculty, what they're interested in, what they want help with. These are meant to be responsive and create agile faculty who are able to do some cool stuff in the classroom. I'm really excited today because I was able to invite Dr. Daniel Reinsholz to join us. And I've actually known Daniel for quite a few years and have been drawn to him as a colleague and a friend because of his commitment to excellence in teaching, but also inclusion, equity, and diversity. Daniel he's an associate professor in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at San Diego State University, where it's sunny all the time and the food is delicious. And, uh, and his work, if you do a Google Scholar search of him, what you'll see is he really, I mean, yes, he has a focus on equity, but where he really shines and is in advancing institutional change. So he's done work with faculty at the department level. He's also an active member of the Accelerating Systemic Change Network, which seeks to support institutions in catalyzing sustainable and scalable changes to STEM higher education in particular. I invited Dan to come talk to us today because he is also really great at developing tangible tools that faculty can use. So it's not just the research, but it's bridging the research to teaching gap. And so I've invited him for kind of back-to-back sessions. He's going to tell us a lot about a tool called Equip. He's going to tell us about some other work, and I'm going to put a plug for his book. It's also in his bio in the email that you got, but this is a guide for disrupting hierarchies in the classroom. And though it says mathematics teaching in the title, you should know that this is really applicable to all higher education classrooms. So with no further ado, Dan, please join our faculty and tell us what you know.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you all for coming here. I know folks are busy, especially finals week, so taking time out of your schedule to share space together is just lovely. So I'm looking forward to spending the time. I will share a bit of my work. I promise I will not lecture to you, and we will have lots of opportunities for discussion, both over voice and chat and things like that. And so I guess, yes, I'm signed up for the double header. So part one is really looking into sort of a case of a particular faculty member that I've worked with in the past and looking at how she transformed her own teaching. And then in part two, I'm going to get a lot more into kind of the methodology and how that all works. So here you go. I'm going to do a very quick intro on participation and learning. It's kind of a little review, but I think nice to just have a little bit of common ground for folks. So as we know, through a lot of research over many decades, that people learn by doing things, and especially folks who are parents or caregivers just see this firsthand with your little ones. As you're trying to teach them how to do anything, they have to practice and practice and practice again with feedback. And much it is both with these kind of everyday activities that we do, but also, you know, the work of our disciplines, and that students really need opportunities to practice and reflect on that practice. A couple concrete reasons why. I could give like 100 citations for each of these. But when we explain our ideas, that forces us to consolidate what we know. When we interact with others, that allows us to both practice and get feedback on what we're doing. And then sort of the third piece is that when we're part of a learning community of peers doing this disciplinary work, it helps us see ourselves as a member as a chemist or a physicist or a biologist or whatever the discipline might be. So those are a few of the reasons, and I talk a lot more about it in the book. And also there's an ebook, so I will literally just give the link to that folks can dive into it on your own. It's just out there. Sort of the flip side of that, though, is we know that participation is the core of learning, and work before mine, but especially the work that my colleague Niril Shah and I have done for about 10 years. We've built this tool, Equip, and we're observing classrooms. So we've been in, probably 1,000 classrooms at this point, many more of them in math, but in other disciplines. And we tend to find sort of the same patterns of inequity across spaces with, men talking more in spaces, tends to be more conversation from white students and sometimes Asian students in STEM contexts, non-disabled students, and we can sort of think around these different axes in which there might be privileges within the discipline or in society, and that tends to predict exactly the patterns that we see when we go into classrooms and actually measure them. So here's the equity issue, right? We know if participation is the core of learning, then we want to make sure that all students are getting relevant and fair opportunities to do that in our classrooms. I'm going to just skip that. The last thing I'm going to say here is that I'm sure folks have seen this picture before, probably some of you, maybe not. But so this is like, right, the boxes, equity, equality, all these things. There's a lot of workshops out there on equity and sort of these really general conversations. My experience has been, and maybe some of you have that experience as well, that those conversations are interesting, and also they're not that helpful when it comes to changing something in your classroom, because they really don't lead to the concrete strategies that folks might use. And so everything that we're going to talk about today, and really the approach that I've taken with faculty, is to try to ground really concrete things that we can do in data about our classrooms, rather than sort of these broader conversations. Well, they have their merits that can be useful. In its own, I think conversation rarely leads to change. So how do we get to change? One tool that we've been using is equity data. I'm going to briefly introduce the Equip tool, and we'll talk about it more in the second half. But so there's this key idea that we call it social marker specificity. And that if we want our classrooms to be equitable, it's really helpful to have data about who's participating in our classrooms. I think as instructors, we have gut impressions and we sort of get our feelings, and those tend to not be that accurate, like our gut impressions about a lot of things. And the reason's pretty simple, right? When you're in the front of the classroom, you're teaching, you're balancing so many things, and keeping track of just who's participating and how is just one more thing to do that is basically too much. It's just a cognitive overload. So we can generate the data to sort of offload that to a later conversation. And so this is the Equip tool. It is a web app. You can just go to like equip.ninja, and it's free. You can create an account, use it in your browser. And we've done work sort of across K to graduate school. And I'm a mathematician. My colleague is a mathematician, but we've worked across basically STEM and beyond. And so our whole approach is to ask these social marker questions when we think about equity. And basically it's a who question. Who's getting to do the meaningful things in our classroom that we know lead to learning? Often that's not everyone. Often that's a few students who tend to dominate class sessions in our experience. And so to answer those questions, we generate analytics, which are a combination of what we call discourse dimensions and social markers. So basically, we're looking at what's happening, so sort of the nature of student talk and teacher talk, and then we're looking at the social identities to build analytics, much like the one that you see in the bottom. So we use that as a starting point for conversations around instructional change. And we do this in community because we know everything's better when we work with our colleagues and build on each other's wisdom and experience. And it's also just a little bit more fun that way than trying to do it alone. And so that's all the background. So I'm going to dive into a sort of a specific example of a faculty member. We're going to watch some videos together, and then we're going to have time to kind of observe, notice, name, and discuss every one of those videos, or at least a chunk of them, and then we'll have just discussion time after that. But I want to bring this process to life for you, at the same time showing you what the data actually look like that we're using. Okay, This is funded. This is work has started earlier, but currently this data was collected on my career grant that's coming near a close now. And so the model that we used was working with faculty members, doing coaching, and after they received coaching for a few semesters, we'd bring them back as coaches for other people. And so we sort of had this iterative model of faculty supporting other faculty to learn around equity and instruction. So here is Dr. Wilson, former participant, later coach, who is going to be the coach in the situation that we're going to be looking at. And here's two professors that he was working with. We're going to focus on Dr. Adams on the left. And so, you know, just a little bit about her. She was a full professor of mathematics. She's had a successful career in math. She was at an elite institution, and basically had dedicated much of her career to advancing women in math, both informally and through formal leadership roles that she had taken on. So, you know, this equity piece was something that was really core to her and her identity. But what we found when we actually went into her classroom was interesting, and maybe the story of that shows that intention doesn't always lead to the results that we hope for. So a little bit about her classroom. There was just under 30 students, a little bit more balanced towards men, but relatively split in terms of gender, and basically white and Asian students in the classroom demographics. And so she's going to focus on gender, so that's the most important thing for us. I don't know how much folks do with video. I know some folks do a lot, and some folks haven't really had experience with it. But just kind of some guidelines that I like to use when we're doing things with video is to, you know, it's a vulnerable situation to open your video. These are faculty members who have allowed us to record them as a learning opportunity for others. So I think it's helpful to honor that and not be overly critical of a particular instructor and students, but use it as an opportunity for our own learning, having an inquiry mindset, asking questions, not making assumptions. So Erica, if you can help me out, maybe you can drop these 3 questions in the chat, but these are going to be, we're going to do multiple cycles with these questions each time. What are you noticing? What do you wonder? And is there something that you could take away into your own teaching? Okay, so we'll look at a clip. I'll share the transcript. I'll get out some thoughts related to that. And then we'll do it again, and we'll look at the changes over time. Okay. So this first example is, so I think, Erica, this is the time to pause the recording for a second. Yeah, so take a minute, type in all your thoughts, and when I say waterfall, then we're going to drop them all in the chat. Oops, it's okay. And this is just real quick thoughts. There's no right, there's no wrong answer. Just to get some gut observations, 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to call it out. All right, so 3, 2, 1, waterfall. So drop them all in the chat. And so I'll let folks just on your own kind of go through here. Yeah, okay, so I'll let folks can feel free to keep going in there, but I'm just going to summarize a few comments that I'm seeing as I think folks generally are noting the energy level. It feels very low energy. Students, it's kind of hard to tell if students are really engaged or following along. A couple folks noted there was one student who during 2 of the questions started to hesitantly raise a hand, but either the instructor didn't call on him or didn't see it. And so, yeah, there's definitely elements around wait time that folks are noticing. I think this is interesting because, from my perspective, she's trying to engage her students. She's trying to make a real world example. And she's even trying to ask them questions. But I think what happens is as she starts asking the questions, the classroom culture isn't there, students haven't responded. She keeps simplifying the question. And so at the end, I mean, if you think about an upper division math course, asking students to do one-digit multiplication really isn't the content of the course, right? So really the question that finally gets asked in the end isn't really the type of question she wants her students to grapple with. And I think I could raise my hand. I'm sure folks have experienced that where like you keep simplifying the question because you're like, someone just give me something, right? That's okay. So this is the starting one. So this is baseline. And so this episode basically happened before we had done any work with her. So this is kind of the starting classroom. And this is someone who's been teaching for a while, right? Over a decade. And in the data, so we generate lots of data. I'm only giving you a really tiny slice of it. And in part two, we can go into more depth. There's 16 students who contributed verbally, and it was basically the whole session was a whole class session. And this consisted of 12 different students. It was relatively balanced between, in terms of race, and in terms of gender, it was almost all men who were participating in the class. And we use this little metric we call average contributions. And basically what that is taking contributions from a demographic group and dividing it by the size of that group to just have like a proportionality factor, right? So we could say on average, men participated 0.7 times. On average, women participated 0.36 times. So, about half as much. So that's where we started. And, debrief. So after that happens, after she gets the data, basically this comes in a feedback report. So she has processing time before the coach is meeting with her. And then they have an hour meeting with her and the other instructor as well, and the student coder and the coach. And so I'm just going to pull one quote from that conversation where she says, "I really want to address this business of women not speaking. It bothers me. It doesn't go away. There's a woman standing in front of them. They talk to me outside of class, but it's so hard. Social structures are so entrenched," right? So in a way, this is a problem that she's aware of. But on the other hand, having the data sort of made a feeling of hers very concrete in a way that we could both measure it, but also, and perhaps more importantly, as she started trying new teaching strategies, we could measure the impact of those strategies because we're doing this iteratively with 4 observations over a single semester. So there's a longer conversation, and I'm glossing over some of those details because we only have an hour. But 2 strategies that folks had suggested to her to try in the learning community was what we call having like 5 hands. So asking a question. And so basically, when she asked questions in this first session, most of the time students sometimes raised their hands, sometimes students were just shouting things out, but there wasn't really like a formal structure for how students were to participate. So the idea here is to ask a question and say, I'm going to wait for 5 hands to come up before I call on somebody, right? So as a way to try to increase wait time and get different voices out. And then the second one is something we call priming students after work time. So in order for this to work, first there has to actually be student work time. And so it turns out in her classroom, all the tables are like 2 students side by side. So it's really set up for partner work more than anything, just the physical classroom design. And so, the suggestion was to actually try breaking students into pairs for different activities and then circulating the room while that's happening. So she could sort of almost pre-select students based on, oh, I see this person has an idea that I want to come to the whole class. Let me talk to them privately before we're in the whole class mode. And so that's both a way for her to learn about her students, but also to bring in very specific students with intentionality. And so for her goal was to engage more of the women in her class in a much more intentional way. So any instructor comes in with their own goal, and sort of our element is to help them figure out how can they reach that goal. Okay, so we're going to do another video. We're going to do another pause on the video. it's going to be the same reflections as before. I think we don't have to do the waterfall. I'm actually happy for folks to drop things in chat, or if someone wants to just share something out loud too. I think it's great to unmute if you want to share something. We can get some different voices out too. And let me get the transcript for you in case that's helpful. Oops. Oh, sorry, just to clarify, Ethan, the turn and talk, there, I had cut the video. They had about 2 to 3 minutes. It says you didn't get to see it because I didn't want you to watch 2 to 3 minutes of something you can't listen to. I think someone else had mentioned that too. So yeah, a bit more peer interaction. Sorry, I clearly was not clear when I said that. My apologies. A little bit more higher energy. Not everyone seems to be engaged, but some more students seem to be visual signs of that, note taking and other things, even taking pictures. Some folks noticed. Calling on specific students. I'll have to go back and watch the video. I see a couple people like noting in here that Muriel and Annika seem like they were not paying attention at first. So that's interesting to me. I got to go back to that. Right, but so we can see, and so really this is about 3 weeks later from the first one. So she's been doing some things in her teaching since then. But really the only FaceTime that she's had so far with any kind of learning community is just that 1 hour and kind of that little piece of feedback based on her data. So again, she gets data. Here we can see there were more contributions from students, so more participation, and that's just in the whole class, in addition to all the talk that was happening in their small tables, right? And then also the sort of the distribution of contributions is actually a little bit more for men, so even a little bit more disproportionate this time around. And so it's interesting in the debrief, you know, Dr. Adams mentions, like in prior class sessions, students were blurting things out. It felt dynamic, but I realize not everyone's blurting things out. Everyone now knows that I'm waiting, but it does cause some awkwardness. And I think it's important to kind of recognize the tone of her language, and this comes elsewhere in the conversation, is very tentative. She's like, you know, you're giving me data, you're telling me to do these things, I'm going to try them, but I don't really know that I love them. And I'm not really sure that I'm sold on this yet, right? It's just like, but I'm a good participant. I'm willing to try, so I'll bear with you. But it wasn't like we just like met with her for an hour and gave her some data and everything was changed. That really wasn't how it happened. So in that conversation, there were more discussions around some other techniques you might use in trying to get students to specifically respond to one another's contributions by kind of calling that out directly in her questioning. And then using this think, pair, share to address silence. So what do I mean by that? If we were to go back to the very first video, you know, she asks a question, a reasonable question, rather than simplifying the question or rather than answering it herself, she could say something like, yeah, that's kind of a hard question, right? Maybe y'all need some more time to think about it. Why don't you turn to your partner and we'll come back as a group in 2 minutes, right? So sort of giving more think time to the students, giving them a chance to talk to one another, but it also gives her time to sort of run a diagnostic on like, what the heck went wrong with my question? Why is nobody answering it? Is it because they're not engaged? Is it because they don't understand it? Is it because they're not comfortable? So she could actually get more information, right, by going around the room and sort of buying herself some time. So that's a nice strategy, and that's actually the one that we're going to see her using in the very next video clip. So we're going to do 3. I have 4 clips. I think we're going to do just 3 of them, just for the sake of giving ourselves time to discuss with one another, especially since we started 10 after. And so this is, they're talking, you know, vector spaces, orthogonality, all this stuff that I at least, I think that's the last video we'll do. Same thing as before. Happy to, and really like, I'm happy to have folks if you want to unmute and share something that's totally fine too. That's great. Yep. Share. Between video and slides, there's like a lot of sharing and unsharing that happens on the tech side. Here we go.
I saw there was a pair in the front that I think was a woman and a man, and the woman initially raised her hand and she put it back down, and then she was trying to force him to raise his hand.
Oh.
And he wouldn't do it, and then she kind of sort of raised her hand.
Yeah, yeah. I find that interaction kind of endearing. It's very playful. What are folks noticing? People tend to work together, more hand raising. Right, someone was sitting alone and she asked another student to come talk with her. Yeah, I know the audio is not perfect. I apologize for that. That's what. One day I will get transcripts on the video and they will be even better. Yeah, varied ways to respond, right? Hand raising, thumbs up, verbal, and so forth. So feel free to drop other things in there, but I think folks are kind of getting a sense of the shift that's happened now. So basically at this point, she's received feedback just once or twice, yeah, on the first observation and the second one. So here's the third set of data. So this is the most contributions that we saw yet in any class session. And this is the first time that we actually see the gender balance starting to shift. And you can actually just see that qualitatively in the video based on who's raising hands and who's answering the questions. And so there's some things that happened actually that the professor just implemented on her own that really didn't come directly out of the community debriefs, but in the ways that she was like, now that I'm thinking about this, I want to try some other things. So she's used to play in an orchestra. So she had this conversation with her students around like, basically how like sitting in different places in the orchestra gives you a different perspective on the music. And so she was trying to use that as a way to like get them to think about participating in different ways and in different places in the classroom. They implemented as a class of 2 voices rule, so that somebody spoke and they had to hear 2 other voices before that person could speak again. And then she had these kind of these really like, I think delightfully nerdy classroom activities. And so one of them was like, you know, in linear algebra, rows and columns are really important and students tend to get them confused. So she was using the physical layout of the classroom with the desks as the rows and columns, and had developed some activities to help students get that embodied experience. And then there's a theorem, someone told me what it's called, but she called it the long theorem, where it's basically about 15 statements about vector spaces that are all equivalent. And so these are all if and only if statements. So each one proves the other one. And so she cut the proof into pieces and gave each student like one strip. And then they had to walk around with their room with their strip. And if like whoever they found, they had to prove each other's statements. And then they had to go walk around and find somebody different. So she started to find different ways to both sort of connect the student engagement. Folks mentioned like the variation and ways to engage along in a really way that like deeply connected to the content she was teaching. So we're going to skip this. It's kind of more of the same. She specifically, basically there's a work time. She specifically selects a student to present, and then that student comes up and actually writes some stuff on the board in this one. This graph is sort of the summary of gendered participation over the 4 observations. You know, limitation, a point observation is not a perfect representation of someone's teaching. So, there's kind of variation that happens, right? Let's not take every one of these as absolute truth. But that aside, what I think the two trends that are pretty clear in the data is first, that overall students are just participating more, and more of that participation is starting to come from women in her class, which was sort of the goal that she wanted. And basically the reason for that is a mix of concrete strategies, but because she had the data and because she had support, she was, think, pair, share in and of itself is just a teaching move. But when she was using it with that intentionality of who she wanted to bring into the classroom, that was actually the thing that allowed her to shift the inequities. And so that's where I would argue the pairing of the data alongside the teaching moves is really what allowed her to be, frankly, quite effective when we think about, she got to observation 4, literally having 3 debrief meetings, right? 3 hours of her time. It was really not a lot, but it was this sort of very detailed engagement and structured and spread out over time that made it much more efficient for her. So here's just a little reflection. I actually don't want to read all of this, but just, she's sharing this idea of math trauma was one that came up in the discussions, and she's like, oh, maybe some of my students are traumatized from math. How am I mindful of that and supporting them in a way that's going to bring them in? So I want to have lots of time to talk. So, I'm just curious, there are just questions for folks, like, if you've watched yourselves teach, it's a painful and useful experience. Or if you've had folks use formal protocols, and I'm obviously biased towards this one as this one that I've been developing for equity, but other observation tools are useful for other purposes. What would it be like to be part of one of these learning communities? So these are all rhetorical questions for you to just think about. And I'm going to drop a link to this, Erica. Thank you for the shout out for the book. This came out late last year, and basically, as probably as faculty members, a lot of times there's not really useful concrete strategies for teaching, or like resources that don't. I think a lot of the resources get very theoretical without the direct application to practice. And so this was a book that essentially came out of having run many, many, many of these learning communities, working with over 100 folks, the strategies that we were using with them that they were finding to be useful all in one place. And so the ebook is freely available as sort of a service to the community. So I'm going to drop that link for you all. If you like it, or you want a physical copy, that's available on Amazon, things like that. But feel free to check it out. I'll drop that in there for you. And then there's sort of a second book that I'm working on right now, which is not oriented towards the teaching strategy, but oriented towards the professional development process. And that's under contract, and that'll come out in fall 2025. So that's all I have for this portion. I think we have at least a good 6 minutes for discussion, but for folks who are hanging around for the second half, then we can talk a lot more too. So thank you.
You can drop questions into the chat. You can just unmute and ask. We're a small enough group. I think that's okay.
Yeah. And I just dropped but my homepage has a lot, basically all the research articles, but then also there's a link to the book if you're interested.
Dan, I think you may have said this, but how did you, how big was the coaching team? Was it just one-on-one coaching?
There was just one faculty member and then one student who helped process the data. And then in his case, he was working with 2 faculty members. In other cases, I've worked with up to like 7 or 8 in the same community. I think using the data, if you had 15, 20, it becomes a little bit harder to concretely discuss everybody's classrooms. Not that it's impossible, but we tend to go on the slightly like 5 to 10 size. Question on improvement in response time because students have gained more confidence with the material. There's possible for some elements for that. I think what's interesting, right, is actually in that very first clip, I assume the concept of matrix multiplication is something that every single student in that room had already been taught and probably had a lot of familiarity with, because this is a high-level math course that they were in. So I'm actually assuming the material became less familiar as time went by. But I think the things the teacher was doing to build the culture was really, really critical. Once the students saw that they could participate and do it in a way that was not scary or judgmental, it sort of had this snowball effect for them. And basically every strategy, right, that I put in those slides, I think those are strategies we've used with lots of folks. There's very simple strategies, but have a concrete and measurable impact on participation. All right, we're going all chat. So is student performance part of the tool? So this tool, and maybe I should have said this more clearly later. So the tool that we built is purely for looking at classroom observation and participation as part of research studies. And this is one of the slides I kind of skipped over. We've used that to connect student outcome data that you could have from another system to the patterns of participation. So typically we're using like a mixed methods or multi-measure approach where we use the participation data as one data source, but not the only data source. So there's sort of a natural connection to using that alongside other data streams that you might have available. Oh, Yvonne, how you doing?
Oh, my camera is like behind my computer. It looks like it must have fell. Hi, good afternoon. I had a question. Again, I guess about the app.
Yeah.
And so I can understand a little better. It sounds like the classroom is recorded, and then you have the lead teacher who analyzes that recording with a student. I'm wondering if the data collected is informed by the teacher. In this case, it sounds like she was interested in male versus female or woman versus man participation. What would it look like in the case if it was more specific, or is that possible? Like, for example, I see that students were breaking down between white, Asian, and other. Is data collected for Asian women versus white women versus white males?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And so yes, everything is in the tool is customizable, and basically, right, as like an outside observer, we're not going to tell somebody what matters in their local context, right? I mean, my assumption is that folks locally know much more about your students than someone sitting across the country. And so basically we design that in conversation with an instructor. What are your areas of focus? And so both the types of things that we code, what we call the discourse dimensions, and I know in this, this brief presentation, I just look at raw participation, but actually in the coaching process, we might look at like the types of questions being asked, the depth of student responses, how faculty take up when they do get a student response. There's all these other layers that we're actually coding for, and in the second half, I can dive into that, some of those elements. And the intersectional data is another thing that we can look at. And so, across our research studies, we use this as a tool to think about intersectionality. And that could be, right, like race and gender in the case that you're mentioning. In another study that's under review right now, we're looking at sort of the overlaps between race, gender, language ability, and disability, right? And we're looking at multimodal classrooms. So really, the customizability on the research side or professional development is pretty extensive if someone wants to do it for that purpose.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions or comments? We do have another session, which is a little bit more applied, so you can stick around for that. I think we'll take a 10-minute break to let people have a bio break, a stretch. And I'm going to stop the recording altogether, and we'll see you at 10 after the hour. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you spending the time, and good luck with your your finals and wrapping up the semester.